Hello, welcome again to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Ron Malero.
And we are the FAIRtax guys. And ladies and gentlemen, hang on to your hats. You are about to see a FAIRtax Power Radio first in history event.
Yeah.
Every interview that we have done on FAIRtax Power Radio up until this point, I have done it. Guess who is going to do this one?
Yeah, I always let Bob do the interviews because he's got the background in radio, okay? But this time I felt comfortable enough because I interviewed Steve Hayes. I realized after last week's episode, after I processed the video and broadcast it, a few days ago, we're recording this on the 4th, that instead of talking about Steve Hayes, what he told me a number of years ago about his meeting with Ben Cardin, Senator Ben Cardin. Cardin, yeah. Senator Ben Cardin. Hey, I could talk to Steve and get it directly from him. Exactly how the meeting went. So, and with today's technology, with the Zoom, that's what we did.
You can do that.
Yep, and I felt comfortable enough to talking to Steve. I've known him for a long time. I was somewhat familiar with the subject. So this time, I interviewed him using Zoom from his home to my home, and that's what most of the episode is going to be. And I think you're going to enjoy this.
Yes, the interview will take most of the episode time today. Yeah. But I will point out real quickly that I looked at Congress.gov the other day, and the Congress critters are kind of back on pace. We're not going to have time to talk about any of the stuff that they're doing, but as far as the number of things they are proposing, they were kind of slow out of the gate, but they're back on pace, and we'll hit some of the good ones next week.
Yeah. So, and I just want to mention Grassroots Corner, Chairman's Report. Go to fairtax.org and click the news button up on top. And when you click that, it'll take you to the page where you'll get the Grassroots Corner, like the latest Grassroots Corner is about political media. That's the company that is helping the AFFT get the word out. And the Chairman's Report, I think the most recent Chairman's Report is about the minimum wage. And you'll also see other newsworthy items there. So this is a good way for you to keep abreast of what's going on with real tax reform in this country.
Indeed. Okay. Now, before we get into the interview, we got to get into this.
Oh, yeah.
Defund the IRS.
Because
taxpayers matter.
Yes, and again, thanks to Craig of Orlando for this professionally painted sign. I really like that thing.
Ron Malero interviewing Steve Hayes. Roll it.
Okay. We're pleased to welcome Steve Hayes to FAIRtax Power Radio. Some of you know Steve is the president and chairman of the board for the Americans for Fair Taxation. And Steve has been at this business for quite a while. Steve, thanks, first off, for carving time out of your busy schedule to spend a few minutes with us. Could you just give slightly a little bit of your background? I mean, you have a vast background, so we haven't got time for, especially when it comes to real tax reform. But just tell the audience a little bit of what you've done over the years.
Well, I got involved initially with tax planning as an attorney, and I worked on various types of things to do tax shelters. Had a lot of fun. Worked on ways in which wealthy people and successful people could pay less taxes. Again, got paid very well. In the 80s, though, it became apparent to me that it was a game that maybe I was winning and maybe some of my clients were winning, but everybody else was really losing because the system was a terrible waste of resources and it was terribly unfair to most people. It was rewarding people not for working hard and doing right, but by being able to either one, hide money and hide assets so they weren't taxed, which is illegal, obviously, or two, pay enough money that they could get the kind of tax advice that would allow them to take advantage of little, I won't call them loopholes because they were in the tax code, but little provisions that allowed a person making the same amount of money as someone else, but maybe pay half as much in taxes.
Yeah, if they
This
knew,
seemed to me
if-
to be
if
very
they-
unfair.
yeah,
And this seemed to me to be very unfair.
right. If they could afford somebody that could find those
That's right.
loopholes for them.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I had clients that were embarrassed because they made and paid less taxes than their secretary. And so, but they did it anyway. It wasn't, they didn't stop them from taking the deductions.
Less taxes or a smaller percentage?
No less, dollar wise.
Wow.
Yep. And now they
Wow.
paid their secretaries very well back then, the ones that
Yeah.
I'm talking about. But even so, they made many times what the secretary made, and yet they paid less in actual dollars in taxes because of the things they were able to do.
Yeah.
So in the 80s, I became very disenchanted. I actually went to DC, was very disappointed at the attitude of members of Congress. They seemed to like this game of being able to sell favors. And in 1990, got involved with an initial attempt to form a group that would replace the income tax with a national retail sales tax. It was called Citizens for an Alternative Tax System, or CATS. And it came at the right time because we let out some press releases and were swamped with media requests. And we went from a little group in California to where we were I was on the radio sometimes 5 to 6 times a day, Ron.
Wow.
In different parts of the country.
Yeah.
And this went on for months and months and months because people were disgusted with the IRS and they were disgusted with the way things were moving. And so we had an opportunity and we went ahead. Billy Tozan became our sponsor. Billy had a feeling at the time that you weren't able to eliminate funding for Social Security by putting it into the sales tax. In other words, he just wanted it for income tax. When the Houston group, when I met with them and they decided they wanted to get involved, and Leo and Jack Trotter and Bob McNair, they did their research and determined that the best way to get it passed in their minds was to do the fair tax, which includes the replacement of the payroll tax as well as income tax.
Yeah. Yeah.
Billy was never willing to do that. He felt
Yeah.
it was what he called a bridge too far. And so we stayed separate until Billy retired in 2000. And then we merged our group with the FAIRtax. And so since that time, I've been working on the FAIRtax, and it's been an interesting ride, Ron.
Yeah,
to say
it
the
has.
least.
Now, in last week's episode, Bob and I spent not enough time on the a proposal by Senator Ben Cardin in the previous Congress, in the 116th Congress.
Right.
It was S5031, Progressive Consumption Tax of 2020. And we didn't really have enough time, but I do remember in perhaps one of our leadership meetings or someplace that you had mentioned that at least on one occasion, you had talked to Senator Cardin, because when it says progressive consumption tax, it kind of sounds like the fair tax, but it's not the fair tax, correct?
No. When I met with the Senator Cardin, it was in 2016, and he was very interested in working out a way to work together. And he wanted to discuss his plan, which is effectively, and I'll get into details if you want, but it's a consumption tax on retail goods and services with a $100,000 exemption from income tax, but anyone making over 100,000 would be subject to 3 rates of income tax, 15 to I think a top of the time at the time of 25%. And then he would have a corporate income tax, but he said to me that really what he was going to do is go to a value added tax. He felt like the income tax was too full of problems, and the best way to do it was a value added tax on the corporate level. And part of it was very well thought through because it was at least a step toward getting us some more parity with other countries in that we could treat our exporters the same way that other countries do that have a value added tax. And that is, if there was 20% of the cost of a good that were in value added tax, we could rebate that at the border to the exporter, and then our products would go across and be more able to compete. And conversely, when products came over here, they would be subject to our value added. So he brought that up, and it was funny because I believe that they had looked at a lot of the things that we had discussed about the fair tax. And unfortunately, they weren't willing to do something as simple as the fair tax.
Yeah.
They wanted to retain the income tax, number one.
Yeah.
And the reason for that, quite honestly, was he said fairness. That was it. Now, he and I did not get into a discussion about what's fair or unfair or whatever, but I said, we'll have to disagree on that. And he just smiled and said, fine. And then we talked about the value added tax. And I said to him, one of the problems that I see with getting a value added tax through Congress is that there are a substantial number of Republicans anyway, who are going to oppose a value added tax because they believe it's too hidden. Now that's sort of like speaking out of both sides of their mouths, because under the income tax and the corporate tax, it's very hidden as well because it gets passed through. But that was an objection, and he said, yes, that's true, but I think the trade considerations override it. So it was a logical discussion. And then we talked about what I said was the big omitted in his plan, that he might want to look at seeing how he could amend it. And that was, his plan did not provide for funding for the payroll tax. It left the payroll taxes in place.
Oh.
And I said, Senator, one of the problems that I see is that while you're doing this, and he had a rebate also on the good, the up to 10% tax on all goods and services retail purchased. But I said, one of the problems is you've got a tax that is the very most regressive tax that we have, because every single person who makes $1 is treated the same. It doesn't matter whether they have 3 kids. It doesn't matter if they're 70 or 12.
Yeah.
They're going to be subject to the same rate of tax from $1. And it's going to go up. At that point, it was like 120,000. It's going to go to that point, then stop. And so you cannot have by the definition of regressive tax, you cannot have a more regressive tax. And he looked at me for a minute, and I knew he was thinking about what to say. And he came back and he said, well, that's true, Steve, but I think that most people accept it because it does provide them a safety net at retirement. And he said, I'm not convinced that we could collect the tax the way I'm proposing it if we had to increase it by 40%, which you'd have to do to pay for the funding of Social Security and Medicare that's now being collected from the payroll taxes.
So the value added tax, technically that's a consumption tax, right?
Well, no, it's totally a consumption tax.
Yeah,
and his progressive consumption tax is also a value added tax, but it's levied at the individual basis at the end. But it creates a situation where every vendor who touches the product up to the retail level has to do what is in tax analysis called credit invoice. They look at the value they've added, they pay a tax on it, 10%.
That sounds very complicated.
It's incredibly complicated, and it's consistent with what a lot of members of Congress want, because it gives them lots of flexibility in how they can reward their friends and penalize their enemies, because they can change the way the tax is applied. If the product is bought from one area, like in Europe, there are lots of different.
It allows a lot of congressional tinkering.
That's right, and the ability to tinker more and sell those tinkerings, and that's really important to him, I think. And I asked him, I said, I want you to please consider the idea of stepping back and just looking at the fair tax, because we're not doing anything except trying to raise money in the least disruptive way, and then take that money we raise and then put it over to spending, but make all of your social balancing through the legislative side. And I said, I really believe you can, and I'd love to talk to you more about it. And then he had a call to go on the floor. We must have met 45 minutes. And he had a call to go on the floor, and he said, we need to talk again. And he told his assistant to set it up. And then apparently, and I heard this from a member of Congress from Maryland, not from Ben, apparently he got talked to by Hillary's camp.
Oh.
And he was told to discontinue discussions because they were going to look at using his proposal when she was elected as the proposal to come in and provide all this benefit to lower income people, and because it was a dream for people that want to social engineer.
Yeah.
And so he dropped off. I never could get him, get another meeting. But I think he sincerely was interested in looking at the idea, but I doubt that he could have gotten any traction for it, particularly from the Hillary camp. Because it would have involved giving up too much power and control by Congress.
Oh, yeah. They don't like that. It's interesting that you said that, because I noticed that last year his bill was submitted in mid-December of 2020, almost at the very end of the 116th Congress. It's kind of like he was trying to slip it in without anybody seeing it.
Well, he was doing that, and I believe, and I don't know this because I've only talked to him once, so I can't tell you that I know him. But the reason that I believe that was done was because he's looking at positioning himself for a Biden tax plan. Because when you look at this, and one of the things he said to me, Ron, that's why I think he was reading our material, because he had a big grin on his face when he said it. He said, Steve, if I go to this for people making income up to 100,000, isn't that going to largely handle most of the evasion that goes on? And I said, Senator, I think you're correct. I wasn't calling him Ben. I only met him the first time. I said, Senator, I think you're correct. I think that if you take away the income tax element from that group, you're going to significantly reduce evasion. But you're going to potentially, with your progressive VAT and consumption tax, increase invasion of another kind, because people who buy things will be looking to, because see, if you have a credit of overpaying taxes on the VAT or and I'm sure the progressive tax, he said it'd be just like a credit invoice VAT. What happens is that you put a report in and the Treasury sends you a check for what you overpaid. So guess what happens? All over Europe, all over the other countries that have VATs, there is a cottage, not even a cottage, a huge industry of people making up false invoices showing that VATs have been paid so that they can get money from the government. So you're going to have a different kind of evasion. And it's going to potentially be as big or bigger than you have now. I mean, it's just incredible when you talk to some people who have immigrated from, say, one of the people I dealt with was from Mexico, and he explained that in Mexico, you could not do business honestly. If you were going to hire somebody, you had to hire them, for example, $2,000 a month salary and $4,000 under the table.
Wow.
When you bought a building, you had to do it in such a way that you paid them on paper $300,000 and then another $800,000 under the table, as an example.
Oh my word.
He was giving me examples. He ended up selling his businesses and moving to it because he said, I just decided that I wanted to play things straight. And the only way I could do it was to get out of business and move. Now,
So
everybody else seems to think it's normal.
yeah, it's amazing what people can get accustomed to. Getting back to Senator Cardin's bill, obviously the FAIRtax is superior in many ways. I mean, we've got a couple of minutes left here. Can we list a few of the ways that the FAIRtax is superior to the VAT?
Well, it's superior because it's, in my mind, I mean, if you look at it from a pure economics point of view, they both are taxes on the production of goods. But the difference is that with the FAIRtax, you eliminate all the complexity.
Yeah.
You eliminate all of the lack of transparency, because everything that's taxed is on the front of the slip every time you make a purchase. You don't have people hiding the costs of the VAT, preparation, everything in the price of the goods.
Yeah.
It's all apparent. So, and it's also taking it down to maybe 10% of the population who do retail selling,
Right.
having to account for and pay the tax.
Yeah.
So what we have is something that Congress totally hates, is we have true transparency. Whereas with the Cardin bill, you have bits and pieces of taxes coming out all around you. And in most VAT situations, a lot of them try to price it, including the VAT. Well, you don't know what you paid in the VAT. You just know you paid $800 for that TV. How much of that was VAT? With the sales tax, it's $600. And then you pay the FAIRtax on top of the $600. So you see graphically, whether you're, a young person, an older person, have a very small, limited education, doesn't matter. It's very apparent.
Yeah.
It cannot be hidden. And so I think from that point of view, it's the cleanest. Plus, you don't have to worry about rebating VAT when people overpay or export. Why? Because the FAIRtax only applies to retail sales in the US. So therefore, if a manufacturer goes through 10 steps to finally get a product that they can sell or export, there's never been a tax assessed. So there's nothing complex about it. They just send it overseas at 80%, let's say, of the selling price, and they fight and compete over there. Whereas people importing into the United States, instead of paying only a very small percentage of tax, they end up having to pay the same FAIRtax
Right.
that all the other goods made in the U.S. pay. So we even the playing field.
Yeah. Yeah.
Senator Cardin's bill helps in some ways, but I believe it's like the balloon. You push it in here and it bulges out there.
Yeah.
What I'm concerned about is his bill is very complex, and that you're going to have lots of opportunities to hide the tax, plus to game the system.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's true, and and you did a much better job than Bob and I did the last week in the few minutes that we had. So,
well, I'm sure I had more time.
Yeah, and I wish we had more time, but we've got to leave some time for Bob and I to do the intro and the exit. So I appreciate your time, and using this medium here, we could probably have more discussions on future subjects.
I'd love to. Whatever works out to help, Ron.
Well, Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, thanks for your time. I appreciate it, and stay well.
Thank you, Ron. You too. Bye-bye now.
Good job, Ron.
Thank you.
We're going to get you to do that more often.
No. I'd rather have you do it. But anyways, I enjoyed that. I enjoyed talking to Steve. He's a wealth of information and experience. He's been around the tax reform issue for decades and decades. He's talked with all kinds of people, including the senator from Maryland. All right. And wasn't that insightful and informative what he said about the VAT tax, about Senator Cardin's proposal and so forth? He gave him credit for some things like wanting to reduce evasion.
Yep.
That's good.
But that's it. You would not normally associate evasion with a consumption tax. That was an eye-opener.
I couldn't believe it. In fact, that's the first time I heard that, because I think that's the first time I've had the chance to go into that much detail with Steve. Mm-hmm. But the evasion surrounding the VAT tax is astounding. What he said that it's almost like another industry in Europe of how to evade the VAT tax. And he mentioned also Mexico, that you can't do business legally in Mexico because it's just not done because of the VAT tax. So let me see here. We got a VAT tax that has tremendous evasion problems. We have an income tax that has tremendous evasion problems.
That doesn't leave us too many alternatives, does it?
It leaves us with one really good alternative, and that's the FAIRtax, okay?
All right.
Because it's nearly impossible to evade a sales tax at the retail level.
Amen. So if you would like to help us get the FAIRtax passed, again, we suggest you go back out to PopVox, POPVOX, because all of the comments you made in the last Congress have been reset. We have to start over again. H.R. 25, again, we still don't have a Senate bill. Hopefully we can remedy that in this particular Congress. Go out to PopVox and register your support for the FAIRtax, because the Congress critters at least have staff that look at that.
Yep. And don't forget the store, FAIRtaxStore.org, all right? We have some new palm cards there. They have some different information is organized, and there's a prebate schedule on the back. However, a lot of people still like what we call the prebate card. It's the size of a business card, basic information about the FAIRtax on the front, and the prebate schedule on the back. By the way, we haven't changed, even though the 2021 figures, they're only slightly different than the 2020 figures.
That can make a difference of $1 or $2.
So we're going to use up the current inventory, and then we'll get some new ones. But the concept is very solid. Okay.
All right. Well, again, good job interviewing Steve.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And let everyone know that we'll be back to our normal FAIRtax Power Radio episodes, format with the Congress.gov and everything else next week, because they got some good stuff going. And hopefully in a couple of weeks, we're going to bring back some good stuff from a very special event.
That's right.
All right. Well, until then, I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Ron Malero.
We're the FAIRtax guys. Remind you again that the FAIRtax is the only truly fair tax. And once you understand it,
you'll demand it. Thanks.
Follow the FAIRtax guys on social media and their own website, FAIRtaxguys.com. And check back every week for a new episode of FAIRtax Power Radio.